Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Chapter 28 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. This particular chapter deals with the country during the midst of the Cold War and kind of the overall image that the country tries to present to the rest of the world as a foil to the Soviet Union, as well as all of the civil rights disputes that began during the 1950s and bleed over into the 60s. Okay, so this particular chapter primarily deals with the decade of the 1950s. Okay, so we'll go through some of the major events that occur both at home and abroad. By 1952, once Harry Truman has successfully gone through two different administrations in office, okay, he's served 2 terms now, he's had a pretty embattled presidency in both terms, okay? The public has not really been on board with his domestic policies, and his foreign policies have served him through the end of the Second World War and have been moderately successful in terms of Korea and so forth. So now that we get into the 1950s, he's not really facing a whole lot of support from the rest of the country. So a third term seems most likely not going to happen. For one thing, the Korean War is now in complete deadlock by 1952. Okay, it takes until 1953 again before the actual armistice is signed, and again, even until this day, until the year 2020, now in the 21st century, the Korean War is technically still engaged. It is still actually going on. We're just in a ceasefire. There is a larger economic downturn at the end of Truman's second term in office, so Americans are not really doing as well as he'd hoped. And a lot of the military contracts that have been handed over to corporations and stuff after the Second World War are now being rigged by lobbyists. Okay, so you have special interest groups who are essentially buying the favors of the federal government. And again, it's very similar to what we saw at the end of the 19th century. Okay, the Republican Party and big business are, again, climbing right back into bed with one another. In 1952, former 5-star General Dwight Eisenhower runs for president. Okay, and Eisenhower is extremely popular because, as you can imagine, he is a war hero. Okay, he is the one who led American forces in the end of the Second World War, and he seems to be an individual of unimpeachable character. Okay, for the most part. And he touts something that he refers to as moderate republicanism. Okay, this is a brand new form of the Republican doctrine that Eisenhower brings to the table. First stage of this is he says he's going to restore the authority of state and local governments. Okay, for one thing, the federal government has been blowing itself very largely out of proportion since the middle of the Second World War, and even before that, since the Great Depression began. Okay, once FDR got into office, he began to really expand the federal government at the expense of state and local governments, and so Eisenhower pledges to kind of give a return of authority to that. And he also says that he wants to prevent the federal government from really getting its fingers in too much. He says he doesn't want a whole lot of political engineering. He doesn't want a lot of social engineering going on. Ironically, that doesn't exactly end up panning out because, as we see with a lot of the ads, a lot of the television programs and so forth that occur in the 1950s, there is a lot of social engineering that actually goes on. Okay, a lot of people are socially conditioned to look a certain way, act a certain way, operate a certain way. There's a lot of social conformity that occurs in the 50s. And again, television, radio, and film all really project that image quite a bit. So this particular aspect of moderate republicanism doesn't really go the way that Eisenhower expects it to. And again, this idea of traditional virtues and optimism definitely goes along with the projected image, again, from the ads and so forth. Okay, trying to show that that we have happy family lives in all instances, that America is very monochromatic in terms of skin tone, in terms of ethnicity. I mean, it's all extremely propagandized. Okay, so we'll talk more about that as we go along here, but trying to basically return America back to this idea of a kind of a pre-war moralism, I guess is the best way I can put it here, without getting too much into the extreme. And he's paired with a running mate in the person of Richard Milhous Nixon. Okay, and of course Nixon himself becomes president very infamously at the end of the 1960s and becomes one of the most hated presidents of the 20th century by the time he gets into office himself. Okay, and as you recall, Nixon actually had a little bit of benefit from the New Deal programs himself, right? He worked with the National Youth Administration. He was a student worker who actually got a lot of government sponsorship. So kind of ironic that he ends up going to the conservative side here. And Eisenhower's foreign policy is that he promises that he is going to completely repudiate this idea of containment, okay? And instead of actually trying to just contain communism where he finds it, he plans to take a much more aggressive move toward trying to get rid of it altogether, okay? To try to bring more independence to Eastern Europe. Okay. And Eastern Europe at this point, remember, is still under the control of the Soviet Union. Okay, Joseph Stalin is still the Soviet premier, and most of the Eastern European countries are still being held under his sway. Okay, they're not allowed to have any kind of public elections, or if they are, the elections are very rigged. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of autonomy going on here. And he also says that he is going to, quote, clean up the mess in Washington. Okay, he says, of course, this idea of all these major government programs that were put through by New Dealers and by the Democrats, he's going to try to dismantle some of that. And he says he's going to go to Korea to try to ensure that the conflict comes to an end. Okay, that's one of his biggest promises. And again, the end of the conflict is not exactly what he bargained for, right? It is still something, again, that still continues to this day. The Democrats, meanwhile, nominate the Illinois governor Adlai Stevenson, who actually doesn't get a whole lot of traction. He's not extremely popular. And unsurprisingly, Eisenhower wins the election by a landslide just because of his public popularity. Okay? People know who he is. He's been in everyone's eyes and ears for the better part of the last decade. And the other big thing, too, is that Eisenhower does manage to win the South itself, okay? And this is, again, continuing that little transition that we see throughout the middle part and even to the latter part of the 20th century, where the South changes gradually from being largely democratically driven, people voting Democrat, to people voting for the Republican Party instead. But despite the victory of the Republican Party in the White House, the Democrats still managed to control Congress, okay, but by the slimmest of margins. Now, Eisenhower, as far as being the soldier, the general that he is, he's actually the first one elected as a soldier who becomes president since Ulysses Grant. Okay, so it's been a long time since we've actually had a soldier in the White House. And of course, with this idea of moderate republicanism, he starts to tout the idea of what he calls a middle way presidency. Okay, he doesn't like to really play to the extremist sides of politics very much, and it's really to his credit that even during this particular time period, he manages to have some kind of a bipartisan effort going on in the White House. And he states that he wants to continue to allow Americans to feel free in terms of their individuality, again, even though that doesn't always pan out. But at the same time, he wants to make sure that the welfare of the nation as a whole is addressed. Okay, so he doesn't want to leave people out in the cold, so to speak. And one of the biggest things that he starts to tout, and what a lot of future presidents after him tout as well, is the idea of trying to make the government much more efficient, okay? Trying to shrink it a little bit more, get rid of some of the bureaucracy, and allow it to be a little bit more streamlined. And of course, he wants to try to have some kind of a balance of power between the executive and the legislative branches. And this has been something that's been a problem, of course, throughout the 20th century already so far. We've typically had a president who has either tried to overrule Congress or vice versa. Okay, so again, it's to really much to his credit here that he tries to work with Congress one-on-one and try to actually, have some kind of coexistence with them rather than trying to just exert his authority over them. And of course, at the same time as he does that, the legislative power is reestablished. Okay, so we do have a Congress that manages to get some new policies put into place without the president getting in the way. And he says that he's going to try to reduce the national debt as much as possible, which is a tall order considering we just finished the most expensive war in U.S. history. He's going to try to cut military expenses by shrinking the armed forces back a little bit, try to balance the budget, which he obviously is not able to really ever do. Okay, Andrew Jackson is the one and only president who's ever been able to do that. And he tries to cut taxes again. And again, now that the war is over, that part is probably a little bit easier to maintain. And the other thing that's to his credit as well is that as a Republican president, he does recognize the fact that union workers need to be able to unionize if they want to, okay? That the working class does need that option if they choose to do it. And they need to be able to work with management as well, okay? So he doesn't favor one side or the other, but he does try to get it to where they are able to work with each other. And surprisingly enough, even though he is someone who's interested in getting much more of an aggressive approach to the Soviet Union and to communism in general, he does not like the idea of the arms race continuing to grow. Okay. His idea of peace, the quote here is that he says, peace is maintained not by weapons of war, but by wheat and cotton, milk and wool, meat, timber, and rice. So what he means by that is if we're going to have peace, there's no need to create more weapons of mass destruction in order to get there. Okay, we need to do it economically. We need to work together. We need to ensure the safety and the stability of the country rather than actually try to go out and prevent everybody else from getting the upper hand. Okay, so he has a pretty level-headed approach to this. And his domestic program is given the nickname of dynamic conservatism. Okay, it says that he is going to be conservative when it comes to money, again, trying to scale back budgets and so forth. But at the same time, he's going to be liberal when it comes to human beings. He actually does extend more of a hand to the working class, to the poor class, and so forth, and tries to get everybody on a little bit more of a level playing field here. And he is the one who actually manages to convince Congress to create the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Okay, again, somewhat surprising that a Republican president might be the one to do this, but if there is going to be a Republican president doing it, Eisenhower is obviously the one who would do it because of his desire to work in this nonpartisan way. He also extends Social Security benefits to more workers. Okay, so we now have something that is not trying to be gotten rid of. Okay, and again, Social Security is kind of the crown jewel of the New Deal program. Okay, so most Republicans would be completely against this continuing to exist, but Eisenhower allows it to and actually expands it. He also increases the minimum wage, so now we have individuals who are able to make a little bit more. And he also approves more public housing projects, okay, for a lot of more low-income residents, okay? And this is the point in time, too, again, where a lot of cities in the United States, the major cities in the North in particular, begin to have suburbs that are built outside of the city. So the white middle-class contingency in those cities is starting to move out into the suburbs, and inner-city urban areas, quote-unquote, are kind of becoming a little bit more dilapidated over time. But Eisenhower does create more public housing projects to allow people who are still living in the inner cities to actually have housing they can afford. Now, under Eisenhower, there are two big, large-scale construction projects that actually do end up occurring. The first one is the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is something that actually allows the Great Lakes to connect more efficiently to the Atlantic Ocean, right? So it creates a larger canal along the St. Lawrence River to allow that to connect with the ocean itself. And the biggest one, the one that has the longest standing and the most success, is the Interstate Highway System. Okay, before now, we didn't really have this in the United States. Okay, car culture and machines and stuff kind of got eclipsed for 2 or 3 decades, really, by the 2 world wars. And so these kinds of domestic projects weren't really given as much attention as they do until Eisenhower comes into office. So by 1956, the Federal Highway Act is passed, and this creates the national network of all the highway systems that we see in the U.S. today. Okay, this is what allows states to connect to one another with highways, north and south, east and west. Okay. And most of it is actually funded by federal gasoline taxes, so it's kind of a self-sustainable thing for a while. Okay. It takes 25 years to construct all the highways, as you can imagine, and there are still highways that are being improved and so forth today. If you've lived in Texas longer than 6 months, you realize this very quickly. And by the time it's actually in its first iteration, by the time it's finished for the first time, it stretches for 47,000 miles, and over 55,000 bridges have to be constructed over rivers, over lakes, and so forth. So this is a very, very huge project. And the after effect of it, too, is that it's actually a pretty ingenious thing. It creates something called a multiplier effect. And what this does is not only does it create jobs, right? So we have construction jobs where people can actually find work building these things. It stimulates economic growth because people are able to actually move their cars from one place to the next. And it also creates new industries. Okay, so we have tourism, we have places where people actually begin to take a family vacation through a car. Motor hotels, motels, right, actually are created as a direct result of this, where you can actually find a motel on the side of the road somewhere if you can't get to a major city before sundown. Billboards are constructed for the first time, and now we have the trucking industry too. So all the 18-wheelers and so forth that you see all over the country, this is really when they begin being used to ship things across state lines. And again, this idea of the family vacation by car is something that becomes kind of an American trope for a while. Okay, something again that you see in a lot of television programs, that you see in advertisements, and in movies and all kinds of stuff. And it's a middle class thing in particular. Okay, if you are wealthy enough to own a car, right, then you are able to take your family on a vacation. And it's something that, again, kind of plays into this idea that the U.S. is more prosperous than the Soviet Union. And that's really kind of the undercurrent for this entire thing, is that if we can put forth these economic improvements in the country, then we're basically putting the Soviets to shame. We're basically saying that capitalism is working better than communism does. By 1958, it's estimated that there's about 175 million people in the U.S. at this point, which is still just a little over half of what it is today. Okay, so the population was quite a bit smaller, even only 60, 70 years ago. 57 million Americans out of that 175 million own a car. Okay, so roughly, what is that? Just a little under a third of Americans had a car. And of course, car culture ends up kind of becoming a self-sustaining phenomenon itself. Okay, so we actually have the construction of convenience stores for the first time. Okay, so not only do we have gas pumps and so forth where people come out and do a full service of the car, now you can actually go in, buy a drink, buy a snack, whatever you need. Drive-in movies become a new phenomenon, right? You go in there, you park outside of film theater, you pipe in the microphone to your car, you can hear the film as you watch it from your car. And of course, fast food restaurants too. Okay, so the first drive-through fast food restaurants, McDonald's and so forth, all have their starts right during this time period. Okay, so this really begins to transform American culture, more so perhaps than Eisenhower could have dreamed. As it relates to McCarthyism and the anti-communist witch hunts of the 1950s, once a Republican president in the form of Eisenhower is actually elected into office, McCarthy views this as kind of some national endorsement of his campaign here. He believes that now that he has a potentially conservative president, then he is going to gain more support, more ammunition, and be able to continue his little crusade all throughout the next decade or so. Unfortunately for McCarthy, Eisenhower absolutely cannot stand him. Okay? Even though Eisenhower refuses to engage him directly, refuses to actually directly criticize him, he does say in private that he believes McCarthyism is a self-defeating principle. Okay? He says that ultimately over time, McCarthy is going to end up targeting the wrong people, and it's going to end up getting him in trouble. And that's exactly what ends up happening. McCarthy actually ends up accusing the U.S. Army of being too soft on communism. Okay, and again, if you have a former five-star general, leader of the American forces in World War II in the White House, and you accuse the Army of being too soft on communism, you end up committing political suicide, and that's exactly what happens here. By the spring of 1954, this new series of hearings occurs in Congress, where McCarthy ends up accusing the U.S. Army, and the Army ends up having a large rebuttal to this. Okay, so it ends up leading into a series of hearings within the House that last for 36 days, and it's actually televised too. Okay, so we have 80 million people in the country watching this occur in real time. It's nearly half of the population. And the legal counsel for the Army, a man named Joseph Welch, who you see here, completely outwits what McCarthy tries to do here. Okay, and he says this is nothing more than a smear campaign. He says you are overstepping your bounds dramatically, and this is not helping us at all. And by December, when the Senate makes the final decision on this, they vote 67 to 22 to actually condemn what McCarthy has become over time. Okay, so it effectively puts an end to McCarthyism and to this anti-communist smear campaign. And just a couple of months, or 1 month really before that, when the midterms come around, part of that has to do with the fact that the Democrats managed to take control of both houses of Congress. Okay, so once the Senate becomes a blue wave Senate, so to speak, then it's much easier for them to nip this in the bud and get rid of him. By 1957, unfortunately, McCarthy has hit such a hard downward spiral that he actually ends up drinking himself to death. He ends up dying of alcohol-related liver inflammation. Okay, so it's the fatty liver, so to speak, that happens right before cirrhosis occurs. And his successor, a man named William Proxmire, says that McCarthy was a disgrace. He says that this is someone who's actually trying to sow more discord in American politics and cause us to basically break down from within rather than oppose the enemy from without. Now, as typically ends up occurring after a major war happens, okay, in the first couple of years or so afterward, you tend up seeing a transitional recession that occurs. Okay, the economy is trying to recover basically from everything that's occurred from everything being shipped overseas. By 1953, though, America has bounced back quite considerably. Okay, again, we are on top once again. This time, though, we've learned from our mistakes from the Great Depression, from the stock market crash, and we have a sustainable economy now. Okay, and by 1953, America is producing about 2/3 of all the world's manufactured goods. Okay, so we're riding very, very high here. And within 4 years, the quote that ends up occurring here is something that's actually put quite a bit in society at the point, is that never had so many people anywhere been so well off. Okay, so the floor of living has risen considerably for most Americans. Okay, there's a diminishing amount of people who are in the working class. There's a much larger middle class. Again, whether these numbers are skewed or not based on, social propaganda and so forth as it relates to the Cold War, there is certainly a margin for error there. Okay, this does not obviously apply to everyone. Okay, we'll talk more about that here as we go along. But by and large, most of America is able to afford more things now. They're able to actually bring more commodities into their homes. They're able to afford cars and television sets and houses and all kinds of things. Part of that has to do with the fact that there is a much larger degree of federal expenditures that occur after the war, okay, and this leads to an economic boom. So the government is actually investing in the economy here. Okay, in the 1950s, of course, we had the Highway Act that occurred. That's a large portion of this. The construction of bridges, airports, right? We actually have the aftermath of the Second World War. There's a large surge in airport construction, seaports as well. And again, the global arms race that ends up occurring once we get into a much more direct conflict with the Soviet Union. All of this government expenditure ends up injecting more economic prosperity really into the American economy. And of course, the military budget after 1945, after the war ends, becomes the biggest economic stimulant, okay, because so many of these military technologies now have begun to flood into the private sector, okay, and we start to see government contracts being handed out to local universities to try to stimulate more academic programs, scientific programs, and so forth. So again, the government is investing in the people, and that's really what is helping them so much here. Of course, American manufacturing ends up taking off almost as a direct result of the former here. Okay, so a lot of these factories that were controlled by the federal government are now turned back over to civilian owners when the war ends. Okay, they're no longer making tanks and bombs and planes and so forth. Now they're making cars again, right? They're making all kinds of things that people can actually end up buying and investing money in again. Okay, so it becomes kind of more of an investment cycle than anything else. And again, a lot of this military-related research ends up going into the private sector and creates brand new industries for people to buy brand new products. Okay, so everything from chemicals and plastics, these are two new things especially that end up occurring after the war. Okay, plastic didn't really occur before the Second World War, didn't exist really. And of course, we have a major oil boom that occurs in Texas and in Wyoming. So now we actually have a more direct line of fuel in the United States, and construction of more cars allows that to continue. Electronics and computers are far and away probably the biggest advancement that we see after the Second World War, because this is something that ends up affecting not only the United States, but really the world. Okay, it revolutionizes entertainment, revolutionizes the way information is processed and given to one individual or another, how it's disseminated. And again, aviation ends up becoming the largest employer in the country. And this is where we end up having, again, airports that are constructed. We now have private aviation that ends up being turned over after the war occurs. Howard Hughes and so forth becomes extremely popular. And all of this buildup in the United States is made even more important for the fact that there is no foreign competition to speak of. Okay? All of the other countries that have been involved in the war, just like in the First World War, are decimated by the aftermath. Okay, no major battles really have been fought on American soil, minus the Pearl Harbor attack. And so all of the devastation, all the economic disparities, and so forth, all of that has occurred in Europe and in Southeast Asia. Okay, America has been virtually untouched, and so all the other economies of the world have yet to catch up. Okay, and it takes most of them until the late 70s or into the early 80s before they're really able to do so. And the other big thing, too, is because of the two world wars, because of the dip in between them with the Great Depression, consumer society in America has been very, very repressed throughout this entire period. Okay, people in the 20s had this large period of time where they were able to buy so much, and then for the next 30 years or so, they've been denied that for one reason or another, right? Because the economy has been so poor, because people can't afford things. And now that the war is over, all of this suppressed economic demand has been completely unleashed. Okay. So between 1947 and 1960, it's estimated that the average income for a working class individual increases as much as it does in the previous 50 years. Okay, so this is a massive jump up in terms of the floor of living, again, rising. First credit card begins to appear around 1949. Again, so people are actually beginning to get themselves in debt all over again. And personal indebtedness, just parenthetically here, ends up doubling just due to the economic optimism that people have. People think that the economy is going to do much better than it did in the build-up to the Great Depression, and it does. Okay, so people are more and more willing to actually get themselves indebted and to actually have a line of credit going with a lot of major retailers and so forth, Macy's and all that kind of thing. And the corollary to that, too, is that if you try to be frugal in any way, if you try to save money, if you try to have a personal savings of some sort, if you refuse to spend what money you end up having, it comes across as being somehow unpatriotic, okay? That you are, instead of actually touting America's economic superiority, you're basically letting the Soviets win. You're doing the same thing that they do, scraping what you have into a savings somewhere on the side, and basically rat holing your money. Okay, that frugality is being irresponsible. Okay, it's kind of antithetical here. And the biggest sought-after commodity after the war is a new house. Okay, most people have been living in tenement houses of some kind. They've been living in rental properties, and especially since the Great Depression. Okay, a lot of people lost their homes during the Depression, and they've had to rent for no other recourse. So by 1945, about 40% of Americans end up owning homes. By 1960, that number jumps up to 60%. Okay, so more and more people are actually owning their own houses now, or they're, engaging in a mortgage for a long period term. And in those new houses, they have every kind of new commodity that could exist. Okay, brand new forms of refrigerators, dishwashing machines, clothing washing machines, vacuum cleaners that are easier to store, electric mixers and carving knives, shoe polishers. Every time I look at this particular list, it reminds me of some of the Bugs Bunny cartoons that were done during the 50s and 60s. There's one in particular, I think, that's called The House of Tomorrow, and it's basically a thing where the entire house is powered by machinery, right? Where every appliance is self-sustaining. It knows exactly what to do. There are little robots that come out and shine your shoes and light your pipe and give you a newspaper and all kinds of stuff. So it's done to a ridiculous extent in those cartoons, and it's satired very heavily, but not so far off target, really. And the use of electricity ends up tripling in the country, primarily because of television. Okay? For a brief period of time at the beginning of the 50s, people thought television was going to be just a short-term fad, that it was not going to last. But as we have seen over time, right, this is something that is certainly not going away. Between 1948 and 1952, the number of homes with televisions jumps from 172,000 up to over 15.3 million. Okay, so there are infinitely more people now who own a television who are engaging with it. By 1954, the phenomenon of TV dinners are now a new reality, right? This is something that you can buy in grocery stores, frozen meals that you can heat up and actually sit at a tray, right? You put it on a tray in front of the television and watch it while you eat, okay? And of course, along with television comes all of the propagandized advertisements that we talked about, okay? Everything from consumer products to moral and social values, different lifestyles, jobs, ways of doing vacation, class structure, race relations and gender roles, all of this comes flooding through very, very heavily through television. Okay? And a lot of the programming that you see during the 1950s is extremely skewed, again, specifically to white middle-class males in particular when it comes to the way that gender roles are supposed to be taken up. Men are supposed to be men, women are supposed to be happy homemakers. If you ever watch the TV series Leave It to Beaver, for example, that's the one that most people tend to refer to here. The image of June Cleaver, the wife of the family, as being just a happy homemaker who does nothing but bake goods all day long, take care of the children, and so forth. The children are happy little scamps who cause trouble from time to time, and the husband is off working all the time. Okay, so that's supposed to be the image that America tries to convey to the rest of the world. Okay, and this is something that we refer to as the nuclear family. Okay, the idea of a husband and wife who are happily married in a middle-class home with 2.5 children and a dog. That's the typical definition that you see for this. And most American sitcoms during this time period, and even leading on the way up into satirical ones like The Simpsons, for example, all deal with a nuclear family. Okay, so that's why you start to see this happen. And of course, 9 times out of 10, it is a white middle-class family. Only in a couple of instances do you see a family that is blended somehow, that is potentially multi-ethnic or multiracial, or a family that is not white at all. Okay, and so for those who are taking my class, you will kind of see some examples of this in the discussion board, but certain television programs even become very controversial because not only do they portray non-white families and non-white neighborhoods and lifestyles and so forth, but also because they tend to follow a lot of racial stereotypes. The TV program Amos and Andy, for example, is one that is very, very heavily scrutinized for this, primarily because it began as a radio serial before it was actually transitioned to television, and the men who created it were 2 white men, and they were playing black stereotypes in auditory form. They were basically running a minstrel show, is what it amounted to, over the radio, before it was transitioned to television, in which case black actors and actresses were brought in to play the different roles. Okay, so again, for better or for worse, these types of things are eventually brought into syndication. And again, even more popular ones like I Love Lucy. Okay, you have Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, right? And what amounts to what is essentially a blended ethnic marriage here for the first time on television. In 1944, Congress also passes something called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or which is nicknamed the GI Bill of Rights. And the term GI, if you're familiar, of course, with something like GI Joe or something along those lines, GI just means government issue. Okay, so GI Joe is government issue Joe. He's the standard soldier. what this is supposed to be, again, is another way of the Eisenhower administration. Well, actually, this is 1944, so this would be FDR, right, the Roosevelt administration, injecting more social upward mobility in post-war America. Specifically, though, it ends up targeting white soldiers more so than anybody else. Okay? It allows unemployment pay for up to a year, and it gives preference to those applying for government jobs. Okay, so if you are a former soldier who is applying for a job with the federal government, you have a better chance of getting into that position. And it also allows for better loans for home construction, starting a business. You might get a better finance rate. And it also gives access to government hospitals, right? The VA hospitals. And there are some educational subsidies that are allowed as well. Okay, so you might get a grant that is specific to being a veteran of some kind, or you might get a student loan with a better financial rate and that kind of thing. It's estimated with this educational part too that about 8 million former veterans end up attending college, right? They end up enrolling in several job training programs to the tune of about $14.5 billion total. Okay, so this is a very large amount of money that's being put toward this. Again, another way that the government is finally investing back in the people themselves. And before World War II, there was only about 160,000 college graduates on an annual basis in the U.S. Okay, going to college was not a very widespread action like it is today. By 1950, though, over 500,000 people are going to college on an annual basis. So the country is gaining education more and more, in part because of the investment of the federal government. In 1949, 40% of college-enrolled students are estimated to be veterans, okay? And they're the best educated contingency of veterans anywhere in the world. But unfortunately, most of the colleges and universities in the country are still segregated and restricted in some cases, okay? So if you are a black veteran, or even if you are a Hispanic, even if you're Jewish in some cases, there are some universities that will, if they allow you in, they might segregate you, or they might just simply say no to you from the get-go. They might just throw your application in the trash. And if you are a black student who tries to attend a white college, if you are allowed to attend a white college, in many cases you are prevented from entering into athletic programs, into different social events, from joining fraternities or sororities. You're very much excluded from a lot of the amenities that are allowed. So again, institutionalized racism has a lot of deep roots here. And unfortunately, within education especially, education touts itself as being a large opponent of racism, especially today, right? We say that, the more education you have, the wider your perspective becomes over time, and it ends up being rooted out. But unfortunately, at this point in time, that wasn't the case. And black veterans are typically prevented from buying homes in white neighborhoods. Okay, so a lot of neighborhoods are restricted, country clubs and so forth. Again, this is a time period when people are still putting up a lot of barriers. And that includes women in some cases as well. There are very few women veterans who exist. Those who were women veterans might have served in something like the Women's Army Corps. They might have been nurses, something along those lines. And so there's really, these benefits don't really extend to women very often. Okay? And when they do, there's usually some kind of a discrepancy. Okay, that leads to a much more deepening, widening of the income gap that we see. By the end of the war, it's estimated 98% of all cities begin to report a shortage of houses and apartments. Okay, and part of this, again, has to do with the fact that soldiers are coming home from the war, and these inner city places, again, they're still primarily populated by the white middle class, at least at this point in time. Okay? Between 48 and 58, though, right, years 1948, 58, that is, there's a much larger movement from the cities to the suburbs. Okay, so we have 11 million homes that are constructed outside of major cities, and this is what leads to that large migration of the white middle class out of cities and into the into suburban areas. Okay? And the middle class white population primarily migrates not only to suburban areas, but even to certain parts of the United States that are considered part of what is called the Sun Belt. Okay, and this is more of the south and central part of the United States. Right, so California, Arizona, Florida, Texas, and the Southeast, primarily because these are areas of the country that are not only warmer, but also because now we have air conditioning that runs in houses. So living in these areas is not as miserable as it used to be, quite frankly. California has, of course, pretty moderate weather year-round, but if you live in Texas, like many of my students do, this is a pretty miserable place to be in the dead of summer, okay, and even winter for that matter. So again, the advent of air conditioning in homes creates a greater sense of appeal, creates a larger market, and even places like Texas, compared to places like California, real estate values are much lower. Okay, so it's cheaper to live here than it is in a place like California. And of course, suburban living gives a lot of new features to an American family. Okay, it creates a sense of personal freedom and family security, and it allows commuting distance from cities. Okay, so you don't have to live in the city to work in the city, right? You can, live, 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes outside of the city and still be able to get there for work. And by the 1950s, suburbs are growing 6 times faster than the cities themselves. Okay, because again, state and local governments began to invest a little bit more money in, localizing their efforts into suburban areas. And again, this ends up causing a large disparity when it comes to cities themselves, right? This is why urban areas and government housing and so forth tends to fall by the wayside, right? It tends to actually get a lot of neglect over time. And unfortunately, that's where the phrase "there goes the neighborhood" comes from. It's a racially charged phrase, really, because it's basically saying that, if you're a white family living in the inner city and a black family moves into your neighborhood next door, then the idea here is that property values are somehow going to go down, that the standard of living is somehow going to go down because the government is going to end up pulling the plug on a lot of local investments and so forth. So again, it's a horrible idea, again, especially in the 21st century. By the 1970s, more people are living in suburbs than they are in cities. Okay, and by this point, most of the inner cities have gained a much harsher reputation as being centers of crime, centers of racial violence, from one outlet or another. Right? Typically, it's white society that views them in this way. And there's also a major real estate developer named William Levitt who actually leads the charge on a lot of these suburbanization, I guess you could say, efforts in the United States. Okay? He creates something that he refers to as Levittown. It's a community on Long Island of over 17,000 of these little 2-bedroom homes. They're very, very small, too. They're only 750 square feet each. Their price tag is about $7,000, right? A little bit under that. And they sell like hotcakes. Okay, in the first 7 days, he sells over 700 of them. Right, so about 100 homes every single day. And there are several federal and state tax codes that apply to this particular district that ends up favoring homeowners over renters. Okay, so even today, if you own a home, there are certain tax cuts that you can get. If you claim to be homesteading or something like that, you get a little bit of a better tax break than if you're renting a home. And the Federal Housing Administration also begins to ensure that loans are going to be insured up to 95% of their home value. Okay, so if something happens to your home, you get a lot of insurance to cover it. If it burns down, if it floods, if something happens like that, you get a little bit of money to rebuild, essentially. But again, this particular area in Levittown is specifically created for whites only, and a lot of these neighborhoods are that way. One particular court case that actually says that racial restrictions are ruled as illegal in the United States is one called Shelley v. Kramer that occurs in 1948. We also have instances in 1953 where Levittown becomes the largest in the country, has the largest population in the country without any black residents at all. Okay, so there's 70,000 people living in this area, and they're all white. Okay, or they all can at least pass for white. And by 1960, only about 5% of African Americans are able to live in suburbs, quite frankly, because whites are disallowing them access. Okay, white banks are not giving loans out to African Americans. White neighborhoods are restricting, people who live there, restricting residency. So it's the largest barrier really for African Americans, considering that it's the one thing that everybody wants to have after the war. And ironically, one of the biggest things here that strikes me as being ironic is that William Levitt himself is Jewish, and yet he uh, directly discriminates against Jews having residency in Levittown. Part of that has to do with the fact that if you are Jewish in the United States, you have to almost pass for Christian, right, in order to be able to get ahead anywhere in life. Okay, again, it's that sense of white Protestantism that kind of gets associated with the white middle class in America. And if you don't conform to that 100%, then you're thrown into this contingency that is marginalized. Now, again, this idea of the Great Migration that we've discussed already in previous chapters is something that still has not lost any momentum. Okay, there's still a large contingency of blacks from the South moving into the Midwest, into the North, and into the western part of the U.S. after World War II, and it becomes even greater after the war than it did even before the war. So by 1955, over 5 million African Americans have left the South to try to get away from the Jim Crow laws, to just try to have a better life in general. Okay. By 1960, there's more African Americans living in urban areas than in rural areas for the very first time in U.S. history. Okay, so more and more and more of them are moving into major cities. They're moving specifically into the northern part of the United States to get away from a lot of the discrimination that we see in the South. So from 1950 to 1960, 4.5 million blacks have moved into cities. And as a corollary, again, at the same time, 3.6 million whites end up leaving cities for the suburbs. So again, you have a large flood of African Americans moving into cities and a large exodus of whites leaving these cities at the same time. And again, it leads to that economic disparity and it leads to a lot of neglect. But again, just because segregation and racial prejudice is extremely heavy in the South doesn't mean that it's non-existent everywhere else. Okay? And there's several organizations that exist in the U.S. at this point to try to get rid of discrimination altogether. Of course, the NAACP has been in existence since the late 19th century. The Congress of Racial Equality is something that still continues to this day. And the National Urban League as well, okay, specifically advocating for better conditions inside of inner cities. And again, voting discrimination, segregation are all still major realities in most parts of the country. Okay, and Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are finally beginning to encounter some changes as well. Okay, the Bracero program is renewed actually after World War II, so this is allowed to continue. Gives a little bit more social upward mobility for Hispanic Americans. By 1960, Los Angeles has the largest concentration of Mexican Americans anywhere in the United States. Okay, and California in particular has, of course, has a large history of having Mexican Americans migrating to the U.S. Of course, California itself obviously was a Mexican territory for a very long period of time. And a lot of Hispanic and Latino minorities do manage to benefit from the GI Bill, in part, again, for better or for worse, for the fact that they can quote-unquote pass as white. Okay? And this is still the time period when the U.S. Census and so forth is gradually beginning to transition from just giving everyone the designation of white to beginning to designate specific ethnic minorities. And a lot of family relocations are also enabled. So if you are a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, if you're from Puerto Rico, if you're from Mexico, if you're from any place in Central or South America and you live in the United States, in some cases the GI Bill will allow you to relocate your family from your home country to the United States. And between 1940 to 1960, it's estimated that 1 million Puerto Ricans enter U.S. cities. By the late 1960s, too, there's more Puerto Ricans living in New York City than there are living in San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. The role of women also undergoes a dramatic shift after World War II, and it's again trying to take them back to that position of the cult of domesticity, okay, that they are supposed to basically leave the factories, get rid of the coveralls, put back on the house dress, and go back to traditional roles. Okay. And unsurprisingly, just like we saw in the 1920s, most of the advertisements that we see in the country dealing with domestic products, dealing with everything from vacuum cleaners to mixers and so forth, all of it tends to target middle class women. Okay, and they're almost always portrayed, just like the ad in the background here, as happy homemakers, right? Someone who is a caring mother, caring wife, taking care of a child, and so forth. And as you see in most of these things, even in the paintings of Norman Rockwell, for example, it's a very, very highly stylized and highly idealized form of American society. Women are taught to put a lot of value in fine jewelry, specifically pearl necklaces. Okay, if you look at any of um, the sitcoms of the time period, from I Love Lucy even into cartoons like the Flintstones, once they come around in the 1960s, the wife is almost always wearing a pearl necklace. Okay, high heels become an important feature. Having new appliances of some kind, keeping up with housework. It's something that you see the wife of the family doing in almost every single instance. Okay. And again, this image of women being devoted housewives and servants in America is supposed to be a tactic during the Cold War to try to differentiate American women from Soviet women. Okay? Because Soviet women work alongside the men. Okay? They toil in the fields and the factories and so forth, and their life is portrayed as a much harsher one than one enjoyed by a middle class American woman. Okay? And again, this idea of what is called the cult of domesticity is allowed to continue, in many cases all the way up through the 1980s, and even in one or two instances, even into the 21st century. And again, Soviet women are portrayed in many of these ads, even directly portrayed in some fashion ads and so forth, as being dirty, poor, again, working in harsh working conditions, living conditions. The image of a woman kind of stooped over, dirty, wearing a headscarf or something like that in a very poor environment, compared to what you see in the background with a happy, white skin, white teeth, blonde hair, blue-eyed American woman. Right? It presents a very stark contrast. The average age of a married woman in the 1950s goes down to about the age of 19. Okay, so this is marrying extremely early, right? As soon as a woman ends up leaving high school, they essentially go from their father's house or their parents' house into their husband's house. 1956, about 1/4 of all white college women marry while they're still in school, and most of them end up dropping out immediately after they're married. Okay, because again, they're pigeonholed into this particular group of traditional roles. And female students again are again put onto this kind of pathway of home economics courses, interior decoration, family financing, basically anything that can keep them in this particular pathway of the cult of domesticity, anything that can foster that. Also in 1950, women are only about 29% of the workforce, okay, and less than 15% of them are in a professional capacity. So not many women are actually pursuing full-time careers. They're all going back to this traditional role. And most minorities, again, like what you see, stereotyped time and time again, what you see done in film and television and all kinds of stuff, they're usually put back into these low-paying service jobs as maids, as cooks, laundresses, midwives, whatever the case may be. And that has not changed at this point for the better part of 100 years or more. As an extension of the cult of domesticity, what we end up seeing after the First or the Second World War is a record number of Americans being born. And this is where we get the generation known as the baby boomers. Okay? Anybody born between 1941 and 1964 ends up falling into this category. Okay? And as a direct result of this, again, pairing off with that cult of domesticity, we see a large movement of America beginning to look at the social life of children and the needs of children. Okay, because before then, children again were kind of viewed as someone who is seen and not heard, that kind of thing, who is kind of put into kind of a pigeonholed role in and of itself. But after the war, right, a lot of society begins to shift this public image of American life, of family life, And that ends up extending to the role of children as well. Between 1946 and 1964, it's estimated that within the baby boomer generation, 76 million baby boomers are born. And this ends up actually completely reversing a declining birth rate that America had been experiencing for the better part of the last century. And by 1957, baby boomers end up peaking at 4.3 million births in a single year. It's estimated one person is born every 7 seconds in 1957. And most of the young women who end up getting married become pregnant within 7 months of marriage. Okay, so most people are not waiting to have children at this point in time. And between 1940 and 1960, the number of family with 3 children ends up doubling. Again, that's part of that nuclear family we talked about earlier. And the number with 4 children ends up quadrupling. Okay, so people are having more and more children more and more often. And it leads to a lot of psychological and sociological examination and the popularization of individuals like Dr. Benjamin Spock, who you see here. He becomes kind of this social guru on child rearing in the United States. He writes a book called The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. And if you ask anybody from the baby boomer generation, chances are either they or one of their family members had a copy of this book. I mean, it was something like a coffee table book you saw in the home of somebody in a baby boomer generation or the generation that came before. Okay? And so it sells at least 1 million copies, if not more, annually during the 1950s. And of course, the mothers themselves are also put back into this kind of pigeonholed role as it relates to their children. Okay, they're subject to all these different societal whims, to all this propaganda, and so they have to conform to a very specific role and a specific image. Okay, the ideal middle-class mother, according to these propagandized images, is someone who's 32 years old, who is supposed to be pretty, popular, and a white suburban housewife. Okay, that ends up removing most of society almost immediately. She's typically a mother of 4 who is married at the age of 16. Okay, again, if you're in your 30s at this point in the 21st century, it's difficult to imagine yourself in some cases being a parent of 1, much less 4. She's an excellent wife, excellent mother, and volunteer. She is a home manager who basically does everything around the house, and she prefers family over career. And she is a jack of all trades. Right? She's someone who makes her own clothes, has dinner parties, sings in the church choir, very devoted to her husband, drives the kids to school, does the grocery shopping, the chores, everything you can imagine, and in the meantime plans to study French. Okay, so basically there are tons and tons of expectations put on women who are coming out as mothers during this time period. And there is a large post-war surge in the demand for diapers, washing machines, baby food, again, because of this baby boom that occurs. And again, diapers at this point are not disposable yet. Okay, we still are relying on reusable cloth diapers, and that's why washing machines become so popular. And eventually, over time, there is a larger need for more schools, more teachers, because once the baby boomer generation begins to grow, again, they end up entering into schools, and the schools become overcrowded. They overflow. And unsurprisingly, too, as they reach childhood from infancy, there becomes a massive market for toys. Okay, so toys, candy, gums, records, clothing, and comic books, of course, become all extremely popular after the war, large in part because of the baby boomer generation. Okay, so if you're a fan of popular culture, comic books, toys, and so forth, baby boomers are who you have to thank, or at least their parents anyway. And one of the most propagandized images of America after the Second World War is one of it being a religious country. Okay, after the Second World War, there is a massive spike in church and synagogue membership in the United States. Before the war, it's estimated that fewer than half of all adults belonged to a church or synagogue of some kind. And after the war, by 1960, 65% of Americans say that they are members of churches or synagogues of some kind. And again, that number also is skewed because it doesn't include members of Islam and other religions that still are a large minority in the U.S. during this time period. So primarily it's focusing on Christianity and Judaism. And the Cold War, of course, all of the social, political propaganda that goes along with it ends up becoming a direct stimulant to Protestant Christianity. Okay, the idea of there being a godless nation, quote unquote, in the form of Soviet Russia, right? An administration that is ostensibly atheistic, right, is something that can act as a direct foil to a Christian godly nation. And again, the constitutional aspect of this is that America is not a Christian country, right? The founders of the country specifically stated that, there is no mention made of God other than to say that we are, all created in the eyes of God somehow, right? God is created kind of as an abstract idea in the Constitution. It's not an endorsement of Christianity, though. But beginning in the 1950s, the widespread endorsement of Christianity leads to a very thin veil between church and state in a lot of cases. And again, leads to a lot of discrepancies, leads to a lot of politicizing, a lot of Christianizing of politics, right? And vice versa. Okay, so you see a lot of that end up happening here. So having a quote-unquote godly nation in the form of America acts as a direct foil to the godless sense of communism that exists in the Soviet Union. Okay, so again, another way of trying to say that America is somehow a better entity than the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower is one of the largest proponents of this. Again, this idea of returning America to quote-unquote traditional moral values, trying to promote what he refers to as patriotic religiosity is another thing. So in order to be patriotic, you also have to be religious. Okay? And if you are somehow a dissenter in this group, if you are an agnostic, if you're an atheist, if you don't conform to whatever religious ideology that is actually in existence in the country, then you are potentially a Soviet asset, or you are a dissident of some kind. So in 1954, the phrase "one nation under God" is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, before then, it was "one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." So they added "under God" after "one nation." And 2 years later, the phrase "in God we trust" is added to U.S. currency. Okay, instead of "e pluribus unum," the Latin phrase that began the country's motto as being "out of many, one," right? It changes to "in God we trust." Okay, so again, these are small little loopholes that the federal government, and Eisenhower in particular, uses to inject Christian values into mainstream culture. And another very prominent evangelist of the time, a man named Norman Vincent Peale, becomes the individual known as being the best quote-unquote salesman for Protestant Christianity of the time. He writes a book called The Power of Positive Thinking, which is kind of like the book by Dr. Spock, right? It's something that most Americans had a copy of at some point, and is supposed to be some kind of a how-to course on how to have practical Christianity involved in your life, right? It's supposed to lead you to a sense of personal happiness somewhere along the line. Again, it's highly propagandized, though, so take from it what you will. And Peale himself becomes a very widespread individual in terms of his zone of influence. He reaches 30 million people every week via a radio program. He has a television program that he ends up taking, and a weekly newspaper column. So he's almost the first televangelist that we see in the country. And the idea of a drive-in church is something that also becomes popular. This is something really that has not gone away. There are certain places in the country, even today, that hold drive-through church services. And specifically in the South, there are evangelical churches in particular that even hold drive-through healing services in some cases, that if you can imagine it. So again, take from it what you will in terms of some of this. Some of it may seem a bit alien, but but there it is. Now, not everything in the 1950s in the United States is hunky-dory. Okay, not everything is following the same pattern. Not everybody is conforming. Okay, and unsurprisingly, the undercurrent of most of this is that the 1950s is really a period of a lot of social anxiety. Okay, not everybody is thrilled with the direction the country has taken. The tensions with the Soviet Union and so forth all become very, very pronounced during the 1950s and well into the 60s as well. An author named John Kenneth Galbraith actually writes a book called The Affluent Society in 1958, in which he basically says that even though we may have economic growth in the United States, he says it's not something that is really a solution to the social problems that still exist. Okay? And in particular, he points to racial and gender inequalities. And he's absolutely right about this. I mean, if you look again at the pattern of movement in and out of cities in the United States, it overwhelms the entire aspect of everything. Okay, in 1959, it's estimated that only about a fourth of Americans have absolutely no financial assets whatsoever. So 1/4 of the country has no investments. They have no savings account. Over half have no savings account, for that matter, or credit cards of any kind. Okay, so if they want to get a loan, they have no credit history. They have no way of gaining or keeping up with any of the rest of the country here. Nearly 50% of African Americans in the country are below the poverty line. Okay, and only 25% of whites are in that particular contingency. And of course, minorities are kept behind whites in their rate of improvement, most often through institutionalized racism, sometimes through violent means, and just in various forms, they are actively suppressed. And even if minorities manage to make their way north into areas where racial segregation and so forth is not really so pronounced, they might get rejected from a job because they have no education. Okay, so there's all kinds of hurdles and barriers that people end up experiencing, not just in the South. And about 40 million Americans estimated are impoverished during the 1950s, but they're not factored into anything, right? They're ignored. And so this image of a public prosperity and a happy family and so forth that you see in all the Norman Rockwell paintings and so forth ends up actually flying in the face of a lot of the cynical criticism that we get. Okay? So a lot of people in the U.S. look at this and say, this is not what is really going on, right? You're lying to people. So playwrights like Thornton Wilder, for example, begin to refer to the generation of the 1950s as the silent generation. Okay, he says that they're smugly complacent with their lot in life. That if you're a young adult who's coming up in the 1950s, if you're married, if you're successful, if you have children, you really don't seem to care a whole lot, is what he's saying about those who have less than you do. And even the author Norman Mailer says that there's a lot of conformity in the decade itself. People are way too eager to fall in line just so that they can get a paycheck, right? So that they can be accepted by everybody and be popular and happy. And if you read any of the novels from the 1950s, books like Catcher in the Rye, for example, usually they are led by a primary protagonist who is often unreliable, right? Someone who is tormented psychologically for one reason or another, and someone who usually doesn't conform to the rest of society. So Catcher in the Rye in particular is that way. The protagonist is someone who is mentally unstable. He doesn't conform to anything, right? He swears often. He smokes, he drinks, he basically does everything that society says is not the polite thing to do. And so in response to a lot of the social conformity in the 1950s, you see the first real quote-unquote counterculture movement that emerges in the forms of the beats or the beatniks. Okay, so the image of a beatnik that's the most stereotypical is someone like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, right? Someone who is basically potentially a pothead of some kind, right? Someone who smokes marijuana, smokes cigarettes, plays the bongos, drinks coffee, spouts poetry, that kind of thing, snaps their fingers, right? You've seen cartoons and films and so forth that follow this. But so this is kind of this first wave of the counterculture movement before the hippie movement actually happens in the 60s. And they typically rebel against any kind of literary or artistic convention, right? They're very focused on the arts in particular. Most of them are authors or poets, musicians, that kind of thing. And they tend to engage in behavior that's considered reckless or risky, right? Whether it's alcohol or drugs or even, sexual promiscuity. And most of them tend to look toward changing consciousness rather than addressing social problems. Okay, so this fits in more with the counterculture movement of the 60s in terms of the way it branches off. Okay, and so once we get to the 60s, you'll start to see the difference between political dissidents of the 60s and the counterculture movement, because counterculture does this thing, right? It doesn't always follow into a way of actually exacting change politically speaking or socially speaking. It just seeks to change consciousness, typically on an individual level. Now, as it relates to Eisenhower, the Soviet Union, and racial relations, the Soviets themselves, again, try to look at America's racial issues as a way of exploiting the fact that capitalism doesn't work. Okay, they say that Soviet Union doesn't have this problem, that there is no racial disparity in the Soviet Union, and part of that has to do with the fact that the Soviets are very much ethnically singular. Okay, there's a common, or at least a similar or a shared ethnic background. Okay, and of course the history of the United States is very different from the history of the Soviet Union. Okay, slavery was not really practiced in terms of enacting the African slave trade or anything like that in the Soviet Union. So the Americas have this particular stain on its history anyway. And of course, in the United States, Southern blacks are still being threatened with lynching if they try to register to vote. Okay, and in 1952, it's estimated only 20% of eligible blacks end up registering to vote simply out of fear. Right? They're being threatened with violence and death in some cases. And even in the North, there is more systematic racism in place. Okay, there's government laws, there are particular things that are put in place to actually act as hurdles to prevent people from doing it without actually resorting to physical violence. Okay? And segregation is still a fact of life everywhere. Okay, it's not something that's just practiced in the South; it's all over the country. Okay, some places are a little bit more lax about it than other places, but by and large, it's a federal law. And during Eisenhower's first 3 years in office, he does manage to get the public facilities in Washington, D.C. desegregated. Okay? And he also manages to intervene on behalf of African Americans when it comes to the military, specifically in bases in Virginia and South Carolina. And he also hires E. Frederick Morrow to become the first African American in the executive office. Okay, he becomes the administrative officer of special projects. Okay, and this particular title is one that is kind of given as I hesitate to say an honorary title, but an individual who's considered an officer of special projects in any government case or in any major entity of any kind. Really, it's kind of a throwaway position almost. Okay, in terms of the fact that it has no specific designation. And even though there are improvements in Eisenhower's administration, he's still largely silent when it comes to civil rights and race, in part because he's already got the support of Southern Democrats. Okay, so if he moves out of this middle way presidency that he's promised the country, if he goes even slightly to one side or another, then he can upset the balance that he's got in terms of his support. Okay, so again, politics as usual, for better or for worse, and in this case, for worse. And again, he defers to federal or defers to state and local jurisdiction when it comes to these types of things. Again, much in the way that the federal government did all the way leading up to the Civil War in some cases, right? Giving states rights, giving states the right to basically make the final decision when it comes to race and racial relations. And he also expresses doubt that any kind of laws are going to end up changing the attitudes of Americans. Okay, Eisenhower himself seems to be relatively progressive when it comes to racial relations in general, but by and large, he knows that the country itself is still very heavily prejudiced. Okay, and so it's going to be difficult for him to move it forward in any way. He does appoint Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the Warren Court is actually known for being extremely progressive in terms of moving things forward with civil rights. Okay, so this is something that is certainly a step in the right direction. And Warren himself actually practices a lot of social conscience and has a more libertarian attitude while he's in office. Okay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is supposed to be bipartisan or nonpartisan, in fact, and is supposed to actually just look at things objectively. Okay, so to his credit, he manages to maintain that. And again, this is still the time period where there are black schools in the United States, right? Specifically schools that are segregated and are underfunded, they're understaffed, and overcrowded. In particular, there is another court case that occurs in 1950 called Sweat v. Painter. Says that the Supreme Court says that a separate black school in Texas is not equal in quality to whites-only schools. Okay, so this idea of separate but equal facilities exists really in name only. Okay, so black schools are largely being neglected in all this. And Sweat v. Painter is the first real step toward ending racial desegregation, okay? Or ending racial segregation, moving toward desegregation. Now, the landmark case that ends segregation in the United States comes in 1952 in the form of Brown v. Board of Education, okay? This is a case that occurs in Topeka, Kansas. And through about 2 years of deliberation, it takes Earl Warren to finally come to the ruling that separate but equal as a system has no place in public education because it does not equally serve black and white alike. Okay. Furthermore, all the experts who weigh in on the case state that there is a psychological and a sociological impact that occurs due to segregation. Okay, and there was actually an infamous study that was made in the 1940s and 50s that has to do with this very idea. Okay, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it's an instance where a sociologist actually sits down young black children and gives them the option to choose one of two baby dolls to play with. One of the baby dolls is a white blonde baby doll, and the other one is a dark-skinned, black-haired baby doll. Okay, and he's given them the choice to pick whichever one they think is the most beautiful. Okay, and 9 times out of 10, the children tend to choose the white one. Okay, and this is just again, it's another instance of kind of the monstrous after effects of what segregation does to people, right? And even the ads of the time have this same type of impact. Okay, there are ads, one in particular for soap, where there's a young black child washing itself with a soap bar. Okay, and I believe it's a young little girl, and says that she wants to be beautiful like the white children. Okay, so this is it's just a really heavy sense of institutionalized racism that has boiled over into something really outrageous. And obviously, there is no way you would see this type of thing in advertising today. I mean, there's been too many studies. There's too much evidence to indicate that this is something that is obviously very, very harmful to people. Not to mention something that the public would not stand for in any sense of the word. Okay. And Eisenhower, in the midst of all this, even though he still touts this idea of being a middle-of-the-road Republican, says that he is unfavorable to the ruling of desegregating schools. He says that he wants Warren to actually side with the segregationists, mainly because Eisenhower still wants to keep the Southern Democratic vote. Okay, the South has still not yet gone over to the Republican Party side and probably won't for the better part of another decade. Okay, so at this point, the Democratic conservatives are really the ones who are keeping Eisenhower in office in the South. Okay, so unfortunately, he is still playing politics at this point. Rather than actually doing the right thing, he actually does it to further his political career. Okay, so again, politics as usual, unfortunately. In 1955, the Supreme Court says that the public schools in the United States, have to be under the direction of the Supreme Court to completely integrate, okay, to do away with any kind of segregated facilities. Okay, Kentucky and Missouri are the first to integrate in 1954. Alabama and Virginia, though, try to nullify the Supreme Court's decision. Okay, if you recall, back in I believe it was the 1830s, when South Carolina attempted the nullification process, right, and nearly got us involved in another civil war, trying to basically repudiate the federal government's laws. Okay, and that's basically what is going on here. Okay, Alabama and Virginia try to say that this is a matter of states' rights rather than something that the federal government needs to be involved in, and so obviously we're going back down a very familiar road here. In 1954, the senator of Virginia, a guy named Harry Byrd, actually says we need to rise up against the federal government over this and actually enact some sort of massive resistance. So things are getting to a very high boiling point very quickly when it comes to this particular thing. And the senator of Mississippi, a guy named James Eastland, specifically from the Senate floor proclaims white supremacy. He says that Mississippi is never going to integrate under his rule anyway, and it takes it until 1970 before it actually does. Okay, so it's one of the last holdouts in the country to do so. And in the midst of all this, there are several different little entities called citizens' councils that are erected in the South at this point, and it's middle-class versions of the Ku Klux Klan, essentially, is what it amounts to. It's people who all get together to proclaim white supremacy, to lead some kind of an opposition to integration, and for no other reason, for the fact that they just simply don't like the fact that whites and blacks are going to school together. Okay, there is no other ulterior motive besides that. In 1956, this group actually has such an influence in Congress that the document called a Declaration of Constitutional Principles, or the quote-unquote Southern Manifesto, is actually circulated in Congress and is actually signed by 101 members of Congress, repudiating the Brown decision. So there's such a heavy influence of the Southern contingency in the midst of all this that they could actually be the ones to hold up any kind of congressional vote over everything. 6 southern states are still in the midst of being segregated by the end of 1956, 2 years after the decision is made. Okay, so there are several states in the South that are, again, they're hanging up this decision, just like the Emancipation Proclamation was done back in 1865. Okay, in some cases it took a year or two or more after the decision was even made before states would actually fall in line. Okay, and it took the enforcement of the federal government to finally do it. Now, on December 1st of 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, this is the instance where Rosa Parks comes into play. Okay, she is very famously arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white guy. Okay, she actually sits down on the bus after coming off work. She was a seamstress at the time and claimed that she didn't feel like getting up. Right, that this was something where she felt perfectly justified in sitting. And her particular instance is the one that is actually pointed to as being the beginning of the civil rights movement, the modern one that we all know today. The same type of instance, though, actually happened 9 months before this. Okay, and it involved a young girl who did the exact same thing. A 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, who, by the way, is still alive. She was arrested for the exact same offense, refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man. The reason she didn't get any press over this is because she was a pregnant single teenager with a criminal record. Okay, so doesn't really reflect very well in the eyes of the NAACP when she actually does it, but because Rosa Parks is, a middle-aged black woman of mixed ethnicity, technically here, and is actually sitting on the bus talking to an adult white man as well, right? It ends up kind of coming across a little bit more favorable in their eyes. The very next day, a group of black community leaders meet at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and they are the ones who come together and organize the Montgomery boycott of all the local buses. Okay. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. steps in for the first time. He's only 26 years old at the time, okay? And he is the one who is kind of pointed to be the actual leader of this bus boycott. Okay, he is very charismatic. He's very well spoken, very well educated, and he is the one who leads the charge on all this, of course, as we all know. And his whole principle when it comes to opposing these racist laws and so forth is to use something that he refers to as civil disobedience. And this is a principle that's actually borrowed from the Hindu activist Mohandas K. Gandhi, who is sometimes known as Mahatma Gandhi. The word Mahatma just means great soul. Okay? And Mahatma Gandhi was actually a lawyer in South Africa for several years at the end of the 19th century leading into the 20th century, and he became more and more of an activist on the rights of Hindus and Muslims who were being suppressed by the racist government in South Africa, and eventually became a nationalist leader in his own country before he was assassinated in 1948. Okay, so it leads a very similar type of life to what Martin Luther King does here. He's noted for being an individual who is associated very much with peaceful protest. Okay, so civil disobedience basically says you protest without actually raising a fist to anybody. Okay, people can punch you, beat you, kick you, shoot you, stab you, all this kind of stuff, but you are not to raise a hand in defense. Okay, and it's supposed to be a way of shaming the opposition, basically. And for the next 381 days, for over a year, all African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, completely shun the buses altogether. Okay, they refuse to ride on them. They actually will carpool. They'll walk on the sidewalk. They'll do everything they can not to sit on the buses. To basically say that this idea of segregating buses is wrong. Okay, not necessarily even just unconstitutional, but just morally wrong. And all of the whites in the region do everything they possibly can to make life miserable for blacks. The police themselves actually get involved here. They actually harass and give tickets to black carpools for trumped up charges. White thugs will actually attack pedestrians on the sidewalk because they're not riding the bus, literally just for walking down the street. And of course, the KKK gets involved as well. Okay, they end up burning down black churches. They bomb houses that are owned by several black community leaders. Martin Luther King's house is bombed at least once. And King himself is arrested twice in the midst of all this. Again, for no other reason than being a rabble-rouser in the eyes of the South. On December 20th of 1956, the Supreme Court says that separate but equal is null and void as it pertains to the law itself. So not only are we talking about schools now, we're talking about the public in general. Okay, so completely desegregating all public facilities is now something that's coming to the forefront. Okay. And the fallout from this is Rosa Parks and her husband end up losing their jobs, and she actually has to move away from Alabama and into Detroit because she's receiving death threats on a regular basis from white supremacists. Parenthetically, little piece of trivia here, when she actually was nearing the later part of her life, I believe it was the CEO of the pizza chain Little Caesars actually paid the rent for her apartment in secret for, I think, the last 20-so years of her life, give or take. By 1956, the Republicans in Congress try their best to exploit any kind of division they can among the Southern Democrats by saying that they want to support the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Okay? And this basically says it's a rehash of everything that we saw in the Civil Rights Acts during Reconstruction, saying that all Americans, regardless of their race and skin color and all that kind of stuff, are allowed to vote. Okay? And the individual who does manage to push it through the Senate and who actually makes sure that it is put into law by 1964 is Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat from Texas who eventually becomes president after JFK is assassinated. And this establishes the Civil Rights Commission, the Civil Rights Division, with both of which are involved in the Justice Department. Okay, so we now actually have a government branch officially dedicated to civil rights. Okay, for the very first time in U.S. history since Reconstruction. Okay, the first and closest thing we had to that before was the Freedmen's Bureau, which went the way of the dinosaur within a couple of years after Andrew Johnson became president. By 1959, though, it seems like none of this is really having much effect. Okay, there are no black voters added to the rolls at all because of all of the increased violence that's occurring in the South. Now, by 1957, the Democratic governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Faubus, passes several different bills to try to increase his authority in the face of all of these civil rights laws that are coming down the chain from the federal government. For one thing, he tries to use his power to actually close all integrated public schools and redirect funding from them to segregated schools. Okay, so he's actually trying to subvert the federal government and nullify the laws that they put in place by exercising his own authority, okay, abusing it, quite frankly. And he even calls out the Arkansas National Guard at one point to try to physically prevent 9 black students from enrolling at Little Rock High School. Okay. And the most famous one in this individual, and the one you see in the photograph in the background, is a 15-year-old girl named Elizabeth Eckford, who, again, is still alive. And the pictures that you see here in the background are her trying to enter the building while white students are actually walking around her, screaming at her, throwing garbage at her. And the young white woman who's standing behind her with her mouth open is actually shouting, "Lynch her." Okay, so there is a clear and present danger of physical violence that's about to occur here. She actually does manage to get in the building, but at great cost to her own personal safety. Okay, she very nearly is killed in the process. And it takes local authorities to actually come out and remove the black students, right? And the mayor actually calls the White House to talk to Eisenhower and says, "Look, we have to figure out what's going on here. What do we need to do?" And Eisenhower, even though he does not want to get involved, even though he has already said that he doesn't really support the whole brown ruling and everything, is that he ends up sending 1,000 soldiers to protect the black students. Okay, so to his credit, he does actually come down on the right side of history here. And the soldiers are forced to stay in Little Rock for the remainder of the school year. Okay, this is something where the Southern Democrats, again, think that this is, some of them even try to call up the Civil War again and say that this is the federal government abusing its power and not recognizing states' rights and all this kind of stuff, and saying that, they're trying to occupy us. Okay, so it's a rehash of very, very familiar territory. At the same time, though, Southern African Americans and Martin Luther King are applauding Eisenhower for his decision here. Again, it's the best choice that he could have made in the moment, given the alternative. Okay? And at the same time, Faubus and the Virginia governor, a guy named J. Lindsay Almond, actually close all local high schools that are going to be integrated rather than have them integrated. Right? They actually do their best to, again, subvert the federal government in the meantime. And there are still 5 states at this point, from South Carolina to Louisiana, that are still segregated. Okay, they still are. The governors themselves are in opposition to what the federal government is having them do. And it seems like Little Rock is really the big stumbling block for the advance of civil rights. Right? It seems like this is almost a failed experiment because of all of the violence and the social uproar that occurs because of it. In January of 1957, Martin Luther King forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it continues the boycott of Montgomery's bus system. Okay. Finally, a couple of years later, after such dedicated opposition to this, the Civil Rights Act of 1960 is passed. Okay. And this is not as effective as the one that's done in 1964, but it requires all federal courts to register African Americans to vote in districts that are being threatened. Okay, so anybody who is being threatened at the polls, they will actually send federal agents out there to register people in person to vote, okay, so that they don't have to go to the polls, try to register while someone might potentially pull out a gun, for example. Unfortunately, though, because of the widespread violence that we see in the South, that has not virtually changed since Reconstruction and since the Jim Crow era, it takes much more enforcement than is actually given. Okay, so it's the opposition is so heavy that the federal government is not able to meet it. Meanwhile, Truman's policy of containment, as we've talked about when it comes to foreign policy here, the whole idea of containing communism when and where it exists is something that Eisenhower looks at and says that this is not something that we can really sustain. He says we need to take a much more aggressive stance on this and actually try to roll back communism instead of try to contain it. And this is where we get the reemergence of John Foster Dulles, who we talked a little bit about when it came to the Treaty of Versailles back in World War I. Okay, this fellow is still in politics at this point. And he was originally the legal counsel for Woodrow Wilson at Versailles. He is the one who came up with the idea of the war guilt clause that made Germany pay $33 billion for the cost of the war. Now, though, he's been made Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower, okay? Different administration, different president, and different political party, too, okay? Remember, Wilson was a Democrat, and so now we have Eisenhower, who's a moderate Republican, still listening to the same guy. And Dulles' advice here is to try to liberate those who are under communist rule. Okay, so rather than actually take a defensive position in any way, we need to take an offensive position and actually go in and try to physically extract communism from wherever it pops up. Okay. And he is extremely dualistic when it comes to his views. Okay, and this is kind of the Cold War mentality anyway, but Dulles is one who actually embodies it before the Cold War ever begins, okay, all the way back to the end of World War I. So he's very us versus them about this. Okay? He says the communists are the enemy, we are the good guys, and we need to continue this little moral crusade. Now, when it comes to Korea, again, this is still at the end of the Korean War at this point, 1953. Eisenhower faces 3 different choices here on what can be done with Korea, because he's already promised after he becomes president that he's going to go to Korea. He can either increase the war effort, right, which is going to be very expensive both in the cost of human life and in terms of dollars. He can continue a military stalemate, which, in other words, is not really going to go anywhere, right? We are going to continue fighting, continue throwing men into the meat grinder, and also potentially waste a lot more money and a lot more lives. or we can try to pursue some kind of negotiated settlement, which is really what ends up happening in the long run. Okay. Dulles is very much out for blood in this particular case. He thinks that the Chinese need to be defeated, and Korea as a peninsula needs to be completely reunified. Okay, and that's ideally what a lot of people want to happen for this particular conflict. Unfortunately, though, the stalemate and a negotiated settlement are really the only two things that can happen at this point. So in 1953, Eisenhower says that he is going to begin using nuclear threats if necessary. Okay, and Dulles is one who actually is calling for them to be used. Okay, that we need to actually drop a bomb on mainland China, just like what MacArthur wanted to do, and or drop one on North Korea. Okay, and so by May, there is an actual aerial bombardment that does increase in North Korea, not atomic weaponry, obviously, but actually just aerial bombing. And on July 25th, or 26th rather, is when the ceasefire is actually signed. Okay, so it takes until July of 1953 before the ceasefire actually happens. But and part of it has to do with the fact that the Chinese are actually running out of money as well. Okay, and North Korea at this point is really taking on the direct sponsorship of China. And China is really being sponsored by the Soviet Union. So it goes all the way back up kind of this almost direct chain of command here, from the Russians to the Chinese to the North Koreans. And to add fuel to the fire here, at least to kind of help bring the conflict to a close, is the fact that in March of 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. Okay, and so the Soviet Union is now in a state of chaos, a state of uncertainty as to who is going to actually precede him in terms of the leadership of the Soviet Union. And parenthetically about that, allegedly, Stalin was so paranoid throughout his life about being poisoned or killed by his own people, he distrusted everyone around him. So when he actually did collapse, I believe it was of a stroke, all of his contemporaries, all the people who are working with him, working for him, were around him when it happened, and they were actually so afraid of him, so afraid of that he would retaliate if they laid a hand on him, that they waited till 2 hours after he was dead before they actually came and tried to render any kind of aid to him, for fear that he would, for fear of reprisal, that he would do something to them. So his own paranoia ultimately is what cost him his life, ironically. And of course, Korea, the whole Korean conflict is something that becomes another transformative war. It sets brand new precedents that we didn't see before in the Second World War. For the first thing, it was actually the first major conflict we see in the 20th century where combat helicopters and fighter jets are actually used. Okay, there were really no fighter jets used in World War II aside from the British planes that we see, the P-51 Mustangs and those kinds of things. We see a few of those, but the first actual fighter subsonic jets, we don't actually see those until Korea. And of course, combat helicopters, mobile army surgical hospitals. This is where the TV show and the film MASH come from, right? They take place during Korea. And now America is viewed as some kind of a world policeman when it comes to communist threats. Okay, and most of this has to do with Harry Truman's domino theory, and eventually with Eisenhower's idea of rolling back communism. Okay, so taking a progressively aggressive stance against communism is really what gets us involved in so many more conflicts like this as time wears on. And this is also the war that ends up leading to a national security apparatus being established in Washington, D.C., okay? And so we start having military bases belonging to the United States suddenly popping up all over the world, okay? And the aftermath of that, of course, too, is all the increasing calls for nuclear war, is that America begins to increase its military stockpile, and specifically its nuclear arsenal, okay? And again, by this point in time, the bombs that are being produced are roughly, I think it's 100,000 times as powerful as the ones used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so if we drop one of these bombs, it can have a devastating effect that can actually irradiate most of the world. And the number of them that exist today is virtually unknown by most people in the world. Okay, most of them are hidden somewhere in the former Soviet Union, sometimes all over the United States as well. Okay, so the present danger still does exist technically. And that being said, when John Foster Dulles actually begins to exert his influence over Eisenhower here, his character really speaks more to the way that he ends up acting on every other aspect. He's a very self-righteous individual, which kind of comes from the Wilson time period. Remember, Woodrow Wilson himself was actually very much a moralist and tried to paint the First World War as being one fought over democratic Christianity. And Dulles himself is very humorless. Okay? He doesn't really have any kind of a sense of humor when it comes to these things. He can't really laugh at himself or anything. He's very paranoid. And he believes that the United States is going to be destined to defeat communism in the long run. He says that this idea of containment is an immoral one, that we don't need to actually, that we're basically doing nothing by doing that. Okay, we need to actually take more action, free people who are actually oppressed by the Soviets. And in a moral stance, yes, it sounds like that is the right thing to do. But in the way that he wants to do it is very, very dangerous. He actually fires the State Department analyst George Kennan, the guy who comes up with the quote-unquote long telegram that assesses communism and the danger that it poses to the United States, mainly because Kennan thinks that Dulles is nuts. And over time, Eisenhower begins to listen more and more to Dulles and all of the extremist views that he brings to the table, and he begins supporting the idea of what is called massive retaliation. Okay, and if the term sounds creepy, it's because it is. Okay, the idea of massive retaliation here is basically to threaten all communist aggression with nuclear warfare. Okay, to say that if you try to ramp up communism in one country or another, all we have to do is press a button and launch a nuclear weapon. And the phrase here that is the most terrifying is that this is considered a maximum deterrent at a bearable cost. In other words, we're not only going to be killing the aggressors who are involved in this, but the civilians they are also oppressing are considered a quote-unquote bearable cost. In other words, we are willing to murder civilians, innocent people in these countries, in addition to the aggressors, just so we make sure and get the job done. Okay, so it's a very questionably moral argument here about whether or not this should be used or not. And of course, there are major weaknesses to this idea. Okay, by the mid-1950s, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union have hydrogen bombs. Okay, and again, this is, I beg your pardon, it's 750 times stronger. I got the numbers mixed up. 750 times stronger than the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombs. Okay, so again, still far and away dramatically more powerful than what we could expect to see. I mean, in the Hiroshima bomb, again, we saw over 100,000 people die by the end of the year, with roughly 80,000 people, I think, killed in the initial blast. Okay, so for something 750 times stronger, you're talking about being able to destroy virtually an entire nation with a single bomb. And again, one hydrogen bomb is capable of exacting really devastating global destruction here. Okay, the nuclear fallout again would cause a nuclear storm basically to occur. Right, it would irradiate the atmosphere. It would send winds across the globe where this radiation could carry like a giant nuclear cloud. It could irradiate crops. It can cause genetic mutations. And there's actually a very it's kind of I won't call it a famous film, but it was one that was done, I think, in the 1960s. I think it was called On the Beach. And it's a science fiction film where this scenario plays out, where there's a group of people who are vacationing, I think, in Australia when a nuclear bomb is detonated, and the nuclear gas cloud, the fallout cloud, is actually heading their way, and they know that they're going to be killed. Okay, so it's just a matter of time before it happens. So there's a long, drawn-out tension involved. But this is everybody's greatest fear during the 50s and the 60s, is that this quote-unquote nuclear exchange is going to occur. Okay, that this idea that if we launch nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union, they could potentially do it to us too and destroy everyone in the world. Okay, and Dulles is naive or bloodthirsty enough to envision using hundreds of hydrogen bombs. And in so doing, he would destroy the world. There is no question about that. Again, just the capability of one hydrogen bomb could very easily kill half of all life on this earth in the after effects and everything. But using hundreds, you would irradiate this planet beyond existence. And the idea of pushing the envelope to the very point where you have your finger on the button, but you have not pressed it yet, is something that is called brinkmanship. Okay, taking things to the brink of total annihilation and pulling back at the last minute. Okay, so it's a very, very reckless way of doing things, and it becomes a common feature during the Cold War. And again, this is why so many baby boomers will recall all of the nuclear air raid drills that occurred during the 1950s and 60s, where school children would hear the air raid sirens go off, and they would hide under their desk as if a desk in a schoolroom is going to actually protect them from a nuclear blast. So it's a horrifying existence, and it's quite literally living under the gun, so to speak. Anytime you see this enacted in film, or if the sound of an air raid siren brings back those types of memories for you, this is exactly why. Now, the other very questionable entity that rises to prominence in the 1950s is the CIA, okay, the Central Intelligence Agency. And Eisenhower and Dulles are the two men who actually manipulate the CIA to begin enacting U.S. interests in foreign countries. Okay? And this is a way of basically sending spies in to sabotage governments, to topple governments, and actually install more favorable governments to the United States. It's in many people's eyes, it's a very immoral way of doing things, very Machiavellian as well. Okay? And there are several nationalist governments, or national movements, I should say, that are taking place all over the world at this point against Britain and against France, two countries of which have been involved in imperialism for a very long period of time. And by the end of the Second World War, we've already seen imperialism go very sharply on the decline, especially after the First World War. But after the Second World War especially, we see a lot of countries begin to rise up against Great Britain and against France and try to push them out. Okay, India in particular is very famous for pushing Great Britain out and eventually partitioning itself off into India and Pakistan. Okay. One other particular country that we can start to focus on a little bit more now is Iran. Okay, 1951, Iran is actually Iran changed its name, by the way, from Persia to Iran, I think around 1935, and now it's known as Iran, of course. It ends up seizing control of the oil industry, which until this point has been operated by the British, and the man in charge of it ends up, the Shah himself, the king of Iran at this point, ends up actually nationalizing it and making it for the Iranian people. Okay. And so the prime minister of Iran, named Mohammad Mossadegh, actually nationalizes the oil industry. Okay. He's the guy who was actually in charge of the government at this point. And the CIA and MI6, which is the British Secret Service, this is allegedly where James Bond is employed. Right? It is an actual entity, but James Bond, obviously, is not a real person that we know of. CIA and MI6 launched something called Operation Ajax to, quote, bring about the fall of Mossadegh. They think that he is threatening British interests when it comes to the oil industry here. And so within a couple of years, the CIA manages to bribe several high-level Iranian army officers to actually stage a coup. They arrest Mossadegh and convict him of high treason, and he's actually placed under house arrest after 3 years of being in prison, and actually dies under house arrest. Then what happens is the U.S. provides a lot of support for the rise of the son of the previous Shah, a guy named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Okay. And Pahlavi becomes the ultimate ally for the United States in Iran up until 1980, when the Islamic Revolution occurs. And Pahlavi becomes kind of a lot of people have accused him since of being an agent of the United States, and even in some cases, some people have accused him of being a CIA agent as well. Okay, but he's the one who actually grants the U.S. access to Iranian oil for the first time. Okay. And so now the Middle East has become a large field of operations for the Western world, for the United States and for Great Britain, all because of the oil. Okay. And Operation Ajax is considered to be a long-term failure, really, because this is really where we're instituting. We brought about the fall of a leader who was actually very intelligent, very well-spoken, very well-read and everything, and we put an incompetent leader in his place. Reza Pahlavi was actually considered to be an autocrat, right? He's a dictator, and his own people actually rose up against him and overthrew him in the long run. And of course, the problem here with the CIA is almost every time that they get involved in a foreign conflict, from this point all the way to the end of the 20th century, they end up toppling a ruler in a specific country, and they replace them with an autocratic dictator, okay, someone that the U.S. government thinks that they can control. In 1954, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz Guzman is actually put in charge of Guatemala. He actually takes over all of the U.S.-owned property and industries that exist in Guatemala specifically. And the CIA actually take warplanes into Honduras and into Guatemala and actually force him into exile. They take him out. And instead, they put Carlos Castillo Armas in his place. And Armas is actually a totalitarian ruler. You can see he's even sporting the little Hitler mustache there. Now, as it relates to Indochina, right, building up to what eventually plays out in the 1960s, Indochina is the name that is the imperial name, really, that's given to the region that contains Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Okay, and in the 1950s, this is another area of the world where nationalism really starts to flare up quite a bit, right, in response to the British and the French in particular, in this case, leaving the region and trying to grant self-rule. Now, the Japanese have occupied this particular region during World War II, and this actually led to the uprising of the group called the Viet Minh. Okay, the Viet Minh is a group that is a nationalist group. They're called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, is the long name of them, and they're led by Ho Chi Minh, who you see down here at the bottom. And Ho Chi Minh is actually a very, very bloodthirsty individual. He's very unassuming. He's even given the nickname of grandfather, I believe, in many cases, because he comes across as being a very benevolent leader and kind of this elder individual, but he actually was very much a bloodthirsty guy. Okay. In September of 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is proclaimed, right, and not too long after the war ends, okay, once the Japanese leave, and the capital is put at Hanoi, up here in the north. Now, in 1946, the First Indochina War actually happens. Okay, the Viet Minh resist the French attempt to try to restore any kind of colonial rule. Okay, just like we said before, this idea of self-determination that the British and the French promised that they were going to continue with after the war ends backfires because they go back on their promise. Okay, and so the Viet Minh step in and say, no, we are going to take back our country. We're going to kick the French out, and it ends up spiraling into something more and more and more over time. The Viet Minh end up controlling the countryside, and the French end up controlling the cities. Okay, and most of the rugged area of Vietnam is actually located in the north and in the jungles nearby. Okay, so the French managed to control cities like what eventually becomes Ho Chi Minh City and areas like that. But over time, the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong later on down the line take control of it. Okay. So the U.S. actually ends up coming in on behalf of the French once the Korean War comes to an end. Okay, we kind of shift away from Korea down into Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And by 1953, the U.S. is actually paying about 80% of the cost of what the French military is doing in Indochina. Okay, we're being almost directly involved in this conflict. We haven't sent soldiers necessarily yet, but we are paying for the guns, the bombs, the guns, the ammunition, all that kind of stuff. And in December, there are 12,000 French soldiers who parachute into a region called Dien Bien Phu in northwest Vietnam, up here near the top of the map. And Dien Bien Phu is an area that's shaped kind of like a bowl. Okay, it's surrounded by hills on all sides. It's a small valley. And their plan there is to build a base and try to overwhelm Viet Minh forces with that little bowl being kind of their area of headquarters. Problem with this, of course, is the geography of the place. Because the French paratroopers, when they actually land in this bowl, they land in a trap. Okay, and they are surrounded on all sides by the Viet Minh, who are constantly bombarding them with gunfire, with shells, and they beg the U.S. to aid them. And Eisenhower says that we are not going to use atomic weaponry here, and what's more, the French are now on their own. Okay, so this gets us in bad odor with the French and also with the Vietnamese, because we have been supporting the French this whole time, and now suddenly they view us as being basically two-faced in all this. On May 7th, the Viet Minh managed to finally overwhelm the French resistance, and French colonialism is effectively put down in Asia. It doesn't ever make a comeback after this. By the end of July, the French, the British, the Soviet Union, the Chinese, and the Viet Minh come together and they sign what is called the Geneva Accords. Okay? And this officially grants Laos and Cambodia independence. And the U.S. and South Vietnam refuse to sign and legitimize communism, though. Okay, so this is really more an effort of the United Nations with the United States and South Vietnam not taking part in this. Okay? And so Vietnam ends up being divided in two at the 17th parallel. Okay, the Viet Minh communists control the north part of the country, and the French in the south part of the country until 1956, when the elections come in, and the French end up leaving, and the Vietnamese government in South Vietnam is created. And this is where Eisenhower begins to reintroduce domino theory. Okay? This idea that we are going to basically pick up where Harry Truman left off, but we're going to continue doing it in a more oppositional way. Okay. Ngo Dinh Diem is the name of the fellow who is actually chosen by the French to succeed them in South Vietnam. Okay, the U.S. support him, but the South Vietnamese do not, because obviously he is someone who is considered a U.S. agent. Okay, this is similar to what we see the CIA doing in other countries. Okay, we have installed someone who the U.S. believes it can control. And as soon as we put him in control, he institutes an autocratic rule. Okay, becomes something of a dictator, ends up alienating most of the Southern communists, and gains so much flack from just about everybody around him that over time he and his family are actually assassinated. Okay, so once we get to the Vietnam War, we'll see how that ends up boiling over. 1957, though, the Viet Cong actually began launching attacks against him. Okay, the Viet Cong are the communist guerrillas. Okay, so the Viet Minh were the actual nationalist group that were trying to keep the French out, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the Viet Cong are now communist guerrillas. Okay, so two different groups, two different motivations here. Now, another side note of what happens here happens in Hungary. Okay, in September of 1955, Eisenhower has a heart attack. Okay, and this ends up causing him to go into declining health, and he can't really get a whole lot done for the rest of his tenure in office. He actually continues to serve all the way until the election of 1960. Okay, this is when John F. Kennedy gets into office. But his declining health causes him to kind of take a step back from politics for a while. He's actually renominated alongside Nixon in 1956, and the Democrats turn again to Adlai Stevenson. Okay, and we get a repeat of what basically happens in the first election. Eisenhower wins by a landslide. In October of 1956, though, we get a group of Hungarian nationalists who end up trying to revolt against communist troops in Budapest. Okay, and Hungary at this point is under the direct auspices of the Soviet Union. It's effectively a communist state with a puppet leader who's in charge of the country. Okay, and the Hungarians are actually encouraged by American propaganda. Okay, they believe that if they can stage a coup or kick the Soviets out of Hungary, then they can establish a constitutional democracy, perhaps. Okay. The Soviets, though, put down this uprising very, very swiftly and very harshly. They end up killing 2,000 Hungarian freedom fighters, and 200,000 more people actually end up fleeing the country before a new government is installed. Okay, so in the midst of the 1950s, there is an actual massive wave of Hungarians who end up leaving Hungary, escaping communism, and actually coming to either Western Europe and or the United States. And this revolution only lasts 12 days, okay, because the Soviet response is so harsh. It's very difficult for any countries under Soviet rule to really gain any kind of independence, okay. And for the better part of the next, call it 40 years or 35 years even, most countries are not able to. In fact, not all countries in Eastern Europe are able to do this. And Eisenhower's response, even though American propaganda has really been what has caused the Hungarian uprising, Eisenhower basically responds with sympathy, and that's it. He doesn't offer to give them any kind of aid, doesn't offer to send any troops or anything to help with the response or anything like that. He just says, sorry that it happened. And John Foster Dulles and Richard Nixon, who is still the vice president at this point, continue to make belligerent comments about America getting involved in Europe. They want America to get involved. Okay, so it sounds like Eisenhower is really trying to be level-headed here, but it sounds like he's doing it for all the wrong reasons. And the Soviets, meanwhile, say that, okay, if you're not going to come in, step in here, we're going to end up taking control. And so Hungary, again, just kind of becomes more and more entrenched in the iron grip of the Soviet Union. And Dulles' only justification in this point is saying that the freedom fighters themselves, the people who rose up against the Soviets, are only violent rebels. Okay, and he basically tries to make the argument that even if the U.S. comes in and installs a capitalist system there, then these violent rebels could potentially just overthrow that, and the whole thing could collapse again. Another episode that happens that's kind of parenthetical here is something called the Suez War. This happens in 1952. An Egyptian officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who you see here, ends up overthrowing the monarchy of King Farouk I of Egypt. And Nasser himself is actually backed by the Soviets. He wants to destroy Israel because Egypt is part of the Arab League here. They're opposed to Israel's existence. He also wants to end imperialism and take control of the Suez Canal, which is being controlled at this point by UN forces. In 1955, Nasser says that he has gone through a massive arms deal with the Soviets, and the U.S. actually offers to help finance a hydroelectric dam at Aswan in Egypt. Okay. A year later, though, Nasser says that he is going to recognize communist China, and he's going to increase trade with the Soviets. Okay. So, in other words, Egypt is effectively siding with the Soviet Union here by doing so. And John Foster Dulles says that we are no longer going to build a hydroelectric dam for you if you're going to side with the Soviets. You're siding with our enemies. Okay, so you, in effect, are our enemy as well. So Nasser ends up seizing control of the Suez Canal, okay, which you see here in this little orange striped zone on the map. Seizes control of the Suez Canal Company and denies all ships bound for Israel passage through the canal. Okay, so he effectively closes it down and tries to choke Israel off. In September of 1956, the Israelis, the British, and the French all plan to invade Egypt to try to regain control of the canal. Okay, and on October 29th, Israeli paratroopers managed to land in Egypt. A few days later, though, the British and the French soldiers end up invading the canal zone, and Nasser sinks all 40 international ships in the canal. Okay, so he ends up actually calling their bluff here. And it takes a few days, but the Anglo-French commandos end up seizing control of the canal finally. And in the midst of all this, the U.S. has decided not to take part. Okay, they've condemned this little incursion by the Israelis, by the British and the French, saying that Israel, Britain, and France need to vacate the Sinai Peninsula here. Okay, and the Sinai Peninsula goes down into Upper Egypt down here near the bottom, and to face severe economic sanctions if they don't. Okay, basically saying that this is not a sanctioned action, right? That the U.S. doesn't approve of it. Okay, so in a way, this is really the U.S. saying that the U.S. believes it should have the final say in these types of incursions, and that the other countries involved didn't ask permission. All three nations, though, end up complying in the long run, and Egypt manages to open the Suez Canal again without any more hostility. So it's a weird little episode that occurs here, and it's really the U.S. Fussing about the fact that it's not involved. Meanwhile, Eisenhower wins re-election very, very easily, 457 electoral votes to 73. And the Democrats are still in control of both houses of Congress, so his administration really hasn't changed, hasn't gained or lost any real authority here. Now, in 1957, the Soviets managed to launch Sputnik. Okay, and Sputnik is the world's first communications satellite. Okay, And if you look at it here in the background, this is the image. Sputnik is a little spherical satellite with 4 different antennae coming out of the top of it. And Sputnik is only about the size of a beach ball. It's very small. It was very easy to launch it really without the rest of the world knowing about it. Okay. And when the Americans find out that this has occurred, they end up panicking almost immediately because they believe that if the Soviets can launch something like this into the atmosphere, then they can launch nuclear weapons from across the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so this becomes a brand new concern that people didn't have before. Okay, up until now, nuclear weapons had to be dropped from an airplane. Okay, but now they could potentially be launched into the atmosphere and at a great distance. And of course, American science and technology has been kind of lagging behind all this. Okay, and so America decides we have to actually enact some kind of a response to make sure we catch up with the Soviets and actually continue on into what eventually becomes the space race. So the Democrats launch an investigation to try to assess what the potential long-distance threat is going to be in this case. Are the Soviets going to be able to manage to launch nuclear weapons across the ocean? And if so, how long is it going to take? So in October of 1958, Congress creates the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as we know is NASA. Okay? And NASA ends up coordinating all research and development concerning outer space. Okay? Any way that we can get involved in outer space, NASA is involved. And as a corollary to that, the National Defense Education Act is put into play. Okay? And this increases government funding and gives large federal grants to any four-year university that has science programs, okay, to try to give any kind of education or research to what is now called STEM programs, okay, science, technology, electronics, and mathematics, and modern languages as well. And so this grants more financial aid to all higher education than any other previous legislation. It's basically saying this new generation of baby boomers that have been born after the war, we need to recruit as many of them as possible into scientific positions to actually try to surpass what the Soviets are doing. Now, Eisenhower looks at the Middle East in particular in this case, and he says that we have to guarantee Western interests in the Middle East. Okay, we've already managed to install Reza Pahlavi in Iran. We've gained control of Iranian oil, but the Suez Canal instance is something where we're kind of beginning to get concerned here. So Eisenhower puts forth the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1958, and Congress approves of it. It basically says something not all too dissimilar to what we saw with the Truman Doctrine. It says we need to extend economic and military aid, specifically in this case to Arab nations, and to use any armed force as necessary to defeat communism. Okay, so we've just added the Arab countries in the midst of all this. And now West Berlin becomes a big point of concern for the U.S. and for the Soviets, okay? Because West Berlin is really the primary area within Soviet territory where the U.S. and the First World actually have a foot firmly planted. So in November of 1958, the new Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev here threatens to give East Germany control of East Berlin and of all airlines into West Berlin. Okay, and Khrushchev becomes extremely infamous for being a warmonger himself. He's actually extremely brash, he's loud, and threatens the United States with total destruction more than once. After the deadline of May 27, 1959 is given, all Western authorities have to recognize that the Soviet government exists, or they have to face another possible blockade like we saw at the end of World War II. Eisenhower, though, listens to John Foster Dulles instead and responds with nuclear threats. Okay. Once September rolls around, Eisenhower and Khrushchev come together and call a summit to try to resolve whatever conflict they can. A few months later, in May of 1960, the U.S. ends up coming out with egg on its face here, because the Soviets shoot down a U.S. spy plane called the U-2 that's flying over the USSR. And at this point, the Soviets managed to catch the Americans in a lie here, okay? Because the Americans say we know nothing about it. This is not our plane. Meanwhile, the Soviets have captured the pilot, okay? A young American man named Francis Gary Powers, and he has been taking photographs of Soviet territories and factories, and the Soviets have now captured him and the photographs, and they've destroyed his plane, which you see here in the background, the wreckage of it. And Eisenhower is forced 10 days later to take public blame for the incident. Okay, so now it seems like countries of the world really can't trust the United States because we're willing to lie to really get what we need. 5 days later, Eisenhower and Khrushchev meet together in Paris, and Khrushchev just steamrolls over Eisenhower, lectures him for 45 minutes on, on being above board, on being transparent, and so forth, kind of ironically, and then leaves. Okay, and so relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at this point going forward are not happy ones at all. Okay, throughout the Eisenhower administration and well into the Kennedy administration, it seems like we're really in not really coming close to any kind of détente here when it comes with the Soviet Union. And Powers is ultimately traded for a captured Soviet spy in 1962, so he's actually in Soviet custody for the next 2 years after this occurs.